Thanks for joining, everyone. I'm just gonna give people one more minute to hop on the webinar, and then we'll get started. All right, I'll go ahead and get started. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today for the Porcupine of the Pacific Northwest webcast. My name is Allie Fisher, and I'll be your MC for tonight. I'm the Wildlife and Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Associate for Oregon Wild. Tonight, I'm really happy to introduce our guest presenter. Cara Appeal is a PhD student from Oregon State University, and we're really happy to have her tonight to talk about porcupine. I would also like to include a land acknowledgement in this space. I would like to offer gratitude to the land itself and for those who have lived here in Oregon since time immemorial. I would like to acknowledge the continuing presence of Indigenous peoples on the land today and their enduring and current relationship with the land, including public lands and spaces where cities, towns, farms, ranches, and timberlands have been built and managed by settlers. I recognize that this land acknowledgement can in no way capture the vast and complexity and nuance that surrounds the history of tribes, as well as the long legacy of colonialism, including forced removal, which still to this day impacts Indigenous peoples. That being said, the most important thing to do is to not only acknowledge the history of Indigenous peoples and the land, but to also create opportunities to do meaningful work in the present by respecting and uplifting tribal sovereignty. Lastly, if any of you decide that you want to buy raffle tickets, they will still be available after the presentation. We have a lot of great prizes. A recording of this webcast will be also available tomorrow on our website, OregonWild.org, and the Wild blog. And then please enter your questions at any time using the Q&A button. We normally get a lot of questions flooding in at the end, so the sooner you can get your questions in, the easier it will be for me to go through and organize them and ask our presenter them when she's done presenting about porcupines. So that being said, Cara, I'll let you have the screen and take it away. Thank you so much.
All right, thanks very much, Allie. Are you able to hear me okay? Okay, yeah. Let me share my screen and make sure I have my notes up, and then I'll get started. All right, sorry about that. One sec. Okay, does that look okay?
Yep, that looks perfect.
All right, thank you. All right, well, thanks so much. And thank you everyone for being here. I'm really excited to see this many people interested in hearing about porcupines. As Ali said, I am currently a PhD student at Oregon State, but I began studying porcupines back in 2014 when I was doing my master's degree at Humboldt State University, now Cal Poly Humboldt in Northern California. So I'm going to be sharing some of my work, but also just some of what I've learned along the way about porcupines, and hope to impart some of my appreciation for them on to you. Sorry, technical glitches. Did that advance?
I'm not seeing it advance right now.
Okay, there we go.
There we go. I see it. Perfect.
Okay, so I'd like to start out with a quote by Rosalie Edge, who's one of my conservation heroes. This isn't about porcupines, but I'll bring it back in a minute. Rosalie Edge was the founder of the Hawk Mountain Sanctuary, which is one of the oldest long-term wildlife monitoring sites in the country. And she started thinking about the importance of keeping an eye on even common species like birds at a time when that wasn't really a priority for a lot of people. And her keeping these records is actually one of the reasons that Rachel Carson was able to point to a decline in raptors due to use of pesticides and herbicides. So I really appreciate and admire her long-term thinking and think that this is a really important concept when we think about wildlife conservation. You know, of course, with limited resources and funding, we always have to prioritize where we direct our attention to have the most impact. But history has shown us that when species that were once common start declining, it's time to start paying attention. So to bring it back to porcupines. Oh, my advancing seems to be a little lagging. So this is a species that is thought to be very common in many areas, and even thought to be a pest, as I will talk about. Oops. Okay. And many people ask the question, you know, why study porcupines? Why is it worth studying them? But in contrast to the last slide, I want to show a few headlines from around the West from the last 5 or 10 years that where people have started to notice that maybe porcupines aren't so common or aren't so abundant anymore. These are newspaper headlines from Montana and California from 2015, 2012, even back in 1997. Which in a couple areas where people have really noticed a decline in porcupines. So thinking about, you know, a once common species that maybe isn't so common anymore. Porcupines were also featured as a cover story in the National Wildlife magazine, which is my next slide. I hope it's not this slow the whole time. A few years ago. So we were able to sort of tell this story. Jennifer Holland, the journalist, did a great job sort of telling the story of our porcupines declining in some areas, what threats do they face, and I'm going to try to tell some of that similar story today. So I mentioned I did my master's research in California. My advisor there at the time, Dr. Tim Bean, he used to start off presentations by asking a few questions of folks in the audience, which I won't do over Zoom, but it was really interesting to see the results. So this was in Humboldt County in northern coastal California. And we would start by asking, you know, how many people, a raised show of hands, how many people had seen a porcupine in the area in the last 30 years, 20 years, 10 years, 5 years. And it was really interesting to see fewer and fewer hands up as we went. And this was a really common pattern that's been not just observed in Northern California, but elsewhere in the West. And I'll get into that more later, why that might be. But again, just to kind of put in your, put this in context of what are porcupines declining and what might be some of the potential causes. Okay, to back up a step and just give a quick outline of what I'll be covering before we get into any of the porcupines in the Northwest or if and why they're declining. I just want to cover what is a porcupine generally, share some interesting life history facts, and talk about the relationship porcupines have with people, because I think it's really interesting and nuanced in a lot of ways. So to start from the very beginning, if you knew that porcupines were rodents, you are already ahead of a lot of people. If you knew that they were herbivores, even better. If you knew that they climbed trees, even better. A lot of people, I think, don't realize those things. I didn't know that, to be honest, for very long before I started studying porcupines. And here in the US, we have only one species called the North American porcupine. Its Latin name is Erithizon dorsatum, which actually that's Greek, but it means essentially provoked. And then dorsatum is of the back. So this refers to the quills and their defensive posture, which I'll get into more in a minute. And being rodents, porcupines have this really characteristic dental pattern you can see on the right with a skull, where they have rodents are known for gnawing, and they have these ever-growing incisors. So I'll talk a bit more about their life history in a minute, but I want to go back in evolutionary history a little bit to talk about where porcupines came from. I know this might be in the weeds a little bit for some people, but I always think it's really interesting to know where animals fit in the tree of life, especially when they're pretty unique, like porcupines are. So I've established that porcupines are rodents, technically members of the order Rodentia, and I'm trying to advance. So this is a phylogenetic tree. Don't need to go into too much detail here, but basically know this is showing where different rodents diverged from common ancestors. And what we can see here is there are essentially three main groups or suborders of rodents. This is simplified a little bit, but at the top we have the mouse-related clade, which has things that we're really used to here: mice, rats, voles, muskrats. Beavers might actually be their own grouping, but that's still kind of changing. Squirrel-related clade has squirrels, chipmunks, marmots, and the mountain beaver that we have here. And then this third big group, you'll notice, doesn't have really rodents that we're used to seeing here in North America. Capybaras, chinchillas, guinea pigs, nutria, and then two families that comprise what are called the Old World porcupines and the New World porcupines. So if we look at where they are back in sort of in terms of relatedness, these two families are actually not that closely related, other than both being rodents in the same suborder, which is really interesting. So if we think about the animals most closely related to porcupines in North America, a lot of people would probably think of beaver or something like that, but it's actually the nutria, which is most people here in Oregon are probably familiar with nutria. They're not actually native to North America, so they were brought from South America for fur, and they've established now. So other than the nutria, there's no other member of this Hystricomorpha suborder of rodents native to North America. So already we're kind of seeing how unique porcupines are in terms of the other animals that we see around here. So how did porcupines end up in North America? Again, going way back here, but this is actually one of my favorite facts about porcupines. My slide will advance. So there was an event back in the Cenozoic period called the the Great American Interchange. I'll go back to that in a minute, which was essentially a transfer of land animals between the Neotropics or South America and the Nearctic or North America. And most animals actually went north to south. So animals that evolved in North America and established in South America include ungulates, so deer, llamas, alpacas, tapir, the big cats, canids, bears, raccoons. There were only three species that went the other way that had evolved or had existed in South America. And once the Panamanian land bridge, offered this mode of transport between, moved north, established in North America, and actually still persist. There were other animals like the giant sloths, ground sloths, that came north but have since gone extinct. But the only three animals that have persisted from that interchange that have come south to north are the armadillo, the opossum, and the porcupine. So again, sort of an oddity in terms of the animals that we see in North America. All right, to go back again, just to the differences between the Old World and the New World porcupines. So there are a lot of hypotheses about when they diverged and whether they had a common ancestor. The current consensus is that they did not have a common ancestor other than one that was a rodent. So basically this means that quills and Old World and New World porcupines evolved convergently, and that animals that moved from Africa to South America were probably not porcupines, but were some ancestor of chinchillas, capybaras, and what became the North American porcupine. You've probably seen pictures or maybe have seen the old world porcupines. They have much longer quills. There are 11 different species distributed in Africa, Asia, and into Southern Europe. There's a big variety among them in terms of size, but mostly they're ground dwelling, as opposed to the New World porcupines, which are more arboreal. And although their quills are ridiculously long, at least for the African and the Indian species of the Old World porcupines, they're actually not barbed like the quills of New World porcupines. And then on the left, so the Ares on today are the New World porcupine family, and they are mostly arboreal. I mentioned there's only one species we have here in North America, but there are about 19 species in Central and South America, including the prehensile-tailed porcupines and the Mexican hairy dwarf porcupine, which is the closest relative to our species here. So it's really interesting to think about, going back to the Great American Interchange, current consensus is that our North American porcupine actually evolved in the tropics and then migrated north. So this is a species that, has been able to adapt, of course, over a very long evolutionary history to a very wide range of conditions. And currently, North American porcupines are very widely distributed across a variety of landscapes. They live everywhere from the deserts in the Southwest, high deserts in the West, montane forests, all the way up to the timberline in Alaska. So, pretty incredible for a species that evolved in the tropics. So how do they make it work? I'm gonna shift gears and go over some life history traits of porcupines that kind of help us understand how they're able to live in all these different areas. So porcupines, specifically now talking about North American porcupines, have filled the niche of an arboreal folivore, which just means that they live in trees and they eat leaves. And I'll get more into their diet a little bit later, but basically they mostly live off of leaves of deciduous trees, some herbaceous plants, bark and needles of conifer trees in the winter, and some mast like apples and acorns in the late summer and early fall. Because they climb a lot, they have some really interesting adaptations. My favorite are their feet. So shown on the right here is a porcupine foot pad, which has this really cool pebbled texture that helps them climb. And they do have these pretty long claws as well. Porcupines, the North American porcupines don't have prehensile tails, but their tail is a really strong muscle that has bristly hairs on the bottom that kind of helps them brace as they're climbing as well. So before moving on, I have a couple of sound clips of porcupines just to kind of break up the talking for a minute. I'm gonna see if it works to play these. So I think it would be best if you turn up your volumes. I'm not quite sure how loud this is going to be, but it seems to work okay. So this is a sound clip someone posted on a naturalist with Creative Commons license, which I appreciate. I don't have any super great audio clips of porcupines myself, but it is something that I've heard in the wild and it is pretty incredible. So I'm just going to go ahead if I can. Oh, I lost my mouse. There we go. Oops. All right, if you weren't able to hear that well, I assure you there are many porcupine sound recordings on the internet. And in recent years, there have actually been some kind of viral porcupines on social media. A couple of rehabilitation centers have porcupines that have very fun vocalizations. You can Google Teddy the porcupine, or some of the rehabilitation centers in Tahoe, California. They have some fun videos to follow. My favorite description of porcupine sounds, someone on social media commented that they sound like munchkins on acid in the forest, and I can't stop thinking about that when I hear it now. So porcupines make vocalizations for a variety of reasons. They are not very social animals, but they do, the mothers and babies spend quite a bit of time together, and so there's often communication between them, or during mating season, either between males competing for mates or between male and female. So we don't know a ton about what their vocalizations mean, but it's definitely fun to listen and speculate. All right, so a couple other things that are important about porcupine life history is because of their diet, their solely herbivorous diet, they're really limited in sodium. So most plant material in nature has a very high potassium to sodium ratio, whereas mammals need almost a 1-to-1 ratio to function. So porcupines seek out salt, like deer do. So they're very attracted to both natural and man-made sources of salt. All right, so because of this lifestyle with eating leaves and climbing trees, porcupines are fairly slow moving. They definitely need a way to defend themselves, and their quills are probably their most defining feature if you had to ask anybody to describe a porcupine. Oh, I think the other audio is playing, sorry. Trying to advance here. Well, there's some more porcupine chatter. Okay. I'm not sure I can. Oops. Okay. Back up one more slide. Okay, so porcupine quills are a really neat adaptation. Quills are actually just modified hairs, and when you see porcupines from a distance, they often look really fluffy. And what you're seeing generally are not the quills, but guard hairs. So porcupines have both quills, guard hairs, under fur that they often shed in the summer, bristles on the bottom of their tail. And you can see from this picture on the bottom, they actually have pretty soft fur on their faces and bellies. So they don't have quills everywhere. Sometimes, so when porcupines feel threatened, they actually erect their quills, so they become more visible from underneath the other fur. And what you're seeing in this middle photo is what's called the rosette. So the porcupine's back has this kind of concentration of quills without a lot of other fur in there. And the white coloration of the quills when they're erected in this way on the back serves as a visual warning, as well as there's some odor that it's emitted from the skin in this area. So basically porcupines are, the first step is just to kind of warn an animal, hey, I'm really dangerous. You don't want to get any closer. You can also see the porcupine's tail in these two photos, which I mentioned is a really strong muscle, and there aren't quills on the bottom of it. So porcupines use the tail as kind of a quill delivery mechanism. So if an animal gets really close, porcupines will turn the back towards the predator so they can hide their face and their belly, which are really vulnerable, and they can whip their tail really, really fast and powerfully and basically lodge a bunch of quills into the predator. So that's kind of the main delivery mechanism for the quill. And it's also, side note, when you're handling porcupines, really important to keep control of the tail. And it actually kind of allows you to handle them. This porcupine in the photo is anesthetized, by the way. And I'm sure a lot of you have heard the myth that porcupines can shoot their quills, which is just that, a myth. But I think that the true way that they're delivered is actually even cooler. So they're just modified hairs, I mentioned, and they're connected with the follicle through connective tissue. And porcupines can actually kind of control when quills are released or not. Otherwise, our hair doesn't just kind of fall out as we're walking around. So when porcupines are relaxed, the quills are lying relaxed kind of along the body. And when they are erected, imagine kind of getting goosebumps, the connective tissue gets tension in it. And that means that when something applies pressure to the quills, it breaks the connective tissues and the quills just come out in whatever it was that applied pressure. So whether that's, you know, an animal or glove, as you can see in the bottom picture, it's sort of a similar mechanism. I like to think of it as like a clicky pen, where you put pressure down, it sort of releases a mechanism and it can come out higher. Another cool thing about porcupine quills is that there's a fatty acid on them that has antibacterial properties. And this is thought to be because, unfortunately, porcupines can be a bit clumsy, fall out of trees, and quill themselves. And so quill injuries don't often result in infections. So most times that predators, you know, get quilled, if they die from the quills, it's usually because they're lodged in their mouth and they can't eat, or in internal organs, but it's not because of infections. And this sort of fatty acid on the skin adaptation is really unique among mammals as well. So speaking of predators, besides being really important prey items, what are the ecological roles of porcupines? We think about sort of the damage that they do, which I'll get into, but I think it's important to think about, you know, why they're, what value they have beyond that. So through feeding on bark and needles, they perform a really important functional role. You know, we talk about the service of damaging trees that woodpeckers and beavers do, and porcupines play a similar role. So their feeding can affect both the structure and composition of forests. So it can create openings to allow light in, to help the understory grow. It can create windbreaks or alter the growth patterns of trees, and actually create standing dead trees, which are valuable commodity and hard to sort of make artificially and managed systems. Porcupines also feed on saplings a lot, so they can sort of help with prevent conifer encroachment. And you know, of course, these are the same things that make porcupines really unpopular, but it's important to think about the ecological effects that these modifications have as well. These are all pictures from the Forest Service in Alaska region and Southeast Alaska, where you can see, even from aerial imagery and sort of looking at a forest from a distance, what sort of standing dead trees and tree damage by porcupines can look like. All right, and then the final bit of life history that I think is interesting about porcupines is their reproductive system. So unlike most other rodents, porcupines have only one young a year, and they're called porcupets, which is of course adorable. And porcupines are really long-lived, so they can live about 20 years in captivity, probably 10 to 12 is more common in the wild. And they have a very long gestation period of 7 months. So porcupine babies are born what we call precocial as opposed to altricial. So they're born pretty well developed and pretty ready to start climbing and moving around. And I've been pretty lucky to be able to see some young porcupets in the course of doing field work with them. All right, so on to the next topic, which is porcupines and people. Porcupines, I mentioned, have a pretty complicated relationship with humans. You know, of course, there's a long history of relationships between indigenous peoples and porcupines in using quills for basketry and regalia, and also for trade items. And there was also hunting and eating of porcupines, often as kind of a last resort in winter. This is sort of propagated a myth that porcupines are protected, and there's a stigma against killing them in some areas because they're thought to be sort of an easy target if you're lost in the woods in the wintertime. Unfortunately, porcupines actually aren't protected in any states or Canadian provinces that I'm aware of, but there is sort of this stigma. And on the other hand, killing porcupines is very accepted in other instances. So, you know, I talked about their diet and how they eat conifer bark and are very sodium limited. And these are things that have made them very unlikable by a lot of people. So I think, you know, this bottom left picture kind of speaks for itself, but it is sort of an illustration of how porcupines are attracted to sodium in man-made or natural settings and can really cause damage to cabins and undersides of cars and things like that. And the other big reason that porcupines are unpopular is because of their habit of eating cambium, which is the inner layer of trees. And this has made them very unpopular with foresters. And this has a very long history that doesn't just involve, casual, removals by private landowners, but very drawn out and concerted control efforts. So these are newspaper headlines from the 1950s in California, and basically describing the attitude at the time, which was, if you see a porcupine, kill it. There were bounties on porcupines. This headline says, war declared on all porcupines. Some of these articles even say, don't waste your bullets on such an invaluable animal, club it or use some other way of killing it instead. And so this was a very popular attitude at the time. It was incentivized and it was systematic. And, I mentioned this wasn't just kind of a thing that individuals did, but there were national efforts by government agencies to control porcupine populations on timberlands and also private timber companies on their lands. So national efforts began in the 1920s, including shooting, bounties, and poisoning. This mostly involved strychnine-soaked salt blocks, like there's a picture up here on the right. And another interesting biological control method was releasing predators of porcupines. If you watched Dr. Katie Moriarty's talk about fishers and martins a few months ago, she talked about how fishers were actually released in Southern Oregon, I think back in the 60s, to try to control porcupine populations. So the problem was perceived to be that bad to need predator controls of porcupine populations. In Oregon, these efforts started at least by 1915. It's the earliest that I could find, but maybe earlier. There we go. And continued up until recently, in the 1990s at least, on a couple national forests. These are these are Oregon-specific headlines around the Bend area in Eastern Oregon, specifically open season on porky. The article in the right, I know it's kind of hard to read, but I wanted to highlight, this says that in 1955, 12,465 porcupines in certain areas of ponderosa pine forest were killed, with still no apparent decrease in the population of animals. So this is a very, very widespread activity. I've heard that there were actually billboards on Interstate 5 and also heading into Eastern Oregon that said, "Kill all porcupines." I'd love to be able to find a picture of one of those. Anyone knows where I can. So, that was definitely the attitude. And, even today, a lot of people who have orchards or timberlands don't view porcupines very favorably. Of course, this makes us think, well, how has this affected porcupine populations today? And I will get into that the end of the talk, but the next thing I want to sort of switch gears talking about is some of the field work that I did studying porcupines in the dunes. This is not the Oregon dunes, actually, but I was in Northern California in the Tolwa dunes, which are about as close to Oregon as you can get while still being in California. It's about 10 miles south of the border on the coast. And this was work that I did as a master's student at Cal Poly Humboldt with my then advisor, Dr. Tim Bean. And when I mentioned that we were asking about reports of people seeing porcupines, and we started putting together maps of where they were in Humboldt County and Del Norte County, and repeatedly, one of the places that kept showing up was this coastal dune area in the far northern corner of the state. And what we wanted to know was, how similar their ecology was in this coastal dune environment to other places where porcupines have been studied. So there is a lot of porcupine research from places like the Midwest and Alaska and the Northeast, areas with really harsh winters, with pine forests, quite different from the coastal system, kind of milder weather, rainy, different vegetation in California, Oregon, and Washington. So that was sort of the impetus for the work that I was doing. And I do want to give a quick plug and just indulgence to share some photos of how beautiful Tall Lagoon State Park is. If you get a chance to visit, again, it's just down 101. As soon as you cross into California, essentially, it's between the Oregon border and the town of Crescent City. Tall Dunes is the home of the Tolowa Dene Nation, and the homelands that are now state park the areas that are now state park are their ancestral homelands. So there's a very important history of historical and current indigenous presence on the land. It's an incredibly beautiful place. There are elk, owls, so many birds. It's right on the Smith River. There are marine mammals and shorebirds. Again, highly encourage you to visit if you can. It's also a great place to see porcupines. So one of the first things I did was to map out the different vegetation types in the study area. When you kind of get in and look more closely, it's very diverse in terms of coastal meadows and willow swales. There's tall, old Sitka spruce forests. A lot of variety within, what we kind of might just think of as the dune system. And to do the study, we captured and radio collared and tracked porcupines for a couple years. This did involve capturing porcupines, which was a very interesting and incredible experience. There, are other studies that have done this, but not in the same sort of system. Other people use traps. Some people, are able to climb trees and capture them that way. And none of these really work in the very thick coastal vegetation that we have out here. And so the method that we came up with that worked great is a 20-gallon trash can. You can see a couple pictures of here. So porcupines are most active at dawn and dusk, like I mentioned. So we would go out after dinner, kind of roam the trails, look and listen for porcupines. This is when they're coming down from trees where they've been feeding and moving to new areas. From trees where they've been sleeping and moving to new areas to feed for the night. So we would capture porcupines, anesthetize them, give them pit tags and radio collars, and then use radio telemetry devices to track them around in all months of the year, actually. And this resulted in some work that was published in the journal Mammalogy with my co-authors, Tim B, my advisor, and fellow student Paris Nobel-Marich, who did a lot of the work on porcupine diet using scat samples. And this advances. So like I mentioned, we were really interested in whether the ecology in the dunes was similar or different to elsewhere. Elsewhere, in areas with really strong seasonality, porcupine diet is really strongly affected by what's available to eat. And we were interested in whether that was similar or different in the dunes. Coastal Delaware County has a really long growing season and, fairly mild summers, but winters can be cool and extremely rainy. And so we were interested in what these seasonal dynamics in their habitat selection and diet looked like. Well, we found that summer was really dominated by coastal willow in their diet. So porcupines are very, very deep in the willow thickets during the summertime. It's often hard to see them in the summer because they're, as deep as you can think of in the very tangled, small, clumpy willows that grow on the dunes. And, we also saw them eating apples, I mentioned, some coast manroot fruit, which is really interesting. It's also called a wild cucumber, and some other herbaceous and semi-aquatic vegetation as well. But we really weren't seeing them so much in the conifer forest out in the dunes and near the beach in the summertime. In the fall and winter, they really start shifting their habitat selection and their diet out towards the dunes and the coastal scrub vegetation types. So the bottom left here is a Pacific wax myrtle. California wax myrtle shrub, which is evergreen shrub, so it has leaves in the winter. This made up a large part of porcupine's diet. You know, willow leaves aren't available in the winter, of course. They also do shift to pine needles, mostly shore pine is what's out there, and bark of conifer trees. These are, you know, this is an example of what a small shore pine looks like out there that's been heavily fed on by porcupines probably over multiple seasons. And we did see porcupines in meadows often, and they seem to sort of shift from being crepuscular to being more diurnal during this period. Just kind of whatever is greening up in the rain, they kind of come out to eat it, even in the rain. They do get pretty desperate for food during this season. So even within the system that maybe has sort of less extreme temperature and climatic variation than other areas, we did see porcupines were very limited in the winter time. This was the time of their highest mortality. We saw, you know, we did several porcupines die during the winter. We measured their body mass. They lost between 8 to 17% of their body mass between summer and winter, which is less than other areas. In some places, it can be up to 40%, which is, you know, makes it very, very hard to survive the winter. But what that means is that not only is the winter food supply, so bark and needles, important, but the ability to store up fat during the spring, summer, and fall months is arguably more important. So the availability of really high quality food in the spring and summer and fall is what allows porcupines to survive the winters. And the winters, you know, in the coastal dunes, while there isn't necessarily snow, there, you know, rain and cold is really hard on porcupines. They're susceptible to pneumonia. It's hard, you know, just to be out and foraging in those climates. They don't hibernate, they're active year round, and they need to be feeding. And so, you know, even with the somewhat milder climate, we did see that pressure as well. And then in the summertime, you know, the willows are very abundant, but in a lot of areas, it's kind of just willows, or willows and alders are things that porcupines don't necessarily feed on as much for nutritional reasons, or they're very highly defended. So, you know, thinking about the diversity of broadleaf vegetation in coastal areas versus, you know, versus mixed forests or places with a lot more mass, like acorns and nuts of different types, you know, that it might actually be limiting to porcupines where they can't put on as much weight in the summertime, in the summer and fall in coastal areas as they can elsewhere. All right, so those were the main takeaways from our field study. And in addition to doing this field work, I spent a bit of time sort of digging into historical records and thinking about the history and distribution of porcupines in the Pacific Northwest. So this is the last section that I want to cover. And this work resulted in a couple of papers. In California, we published in Western Wildlife Journal about the distribution of porcupines. And then just last year, we had a paper in Northwestern Naturalist looking at porcupine distribution and also some survey methods for porcupines in Oregon and Washington as well. So to do this work, I spent a lot of time collecting occurrence records of porcupines in these 3 coastal states. It's involved a lot of, you know, looking at government databases, roadkill records, citizen science reports like iNaturalist, museum specimens, basically any sources we could find. Roadkills are unfortunately a really common way to see porcupines. A lot of people I know who've, you know, maybe haven't seen a porcupine in the wild except for a road-killed porcupine. So that's unfortunately a major cause of mortality for porcupines, but a good source of records for seeing where they have been. So I collected records and split them out into 2 different time periods, a historical time period and contemporary time period from the last 10 years. And then we collected environmental variables about the landscape, habitat types, weather, that sort of thing, and did some distribution models to see what areas were predicted to be most suitable in the historical and contemporary time periods. And then we compared them And this allowed us to see which areas had a change in the relative probability of presence of porcupines from the historical to contemporary time periods in a positive direction or a negative direction. And what we found was that we did find some evidence that porcupines may have shifted their occupied niche in the Pacific Northwest. So basically, we found a higher relative probability of presence compared to historical time periods in places like the Columbia Basin and the valleys. So grasslands, high deserts, desert scrub, compared to forested ecosystems, where we actually found a decrease in the relative probability of presence from historical to contemporary time periods. One interpretation of this is that the current distribution of porcupines is sort of decoupled from the underlying suitability. So it doesn't necessarily matter like how suitable these areas are for porcupines, because there have been other reasons that have influenced their distribution there. And we proposed 3 possible reasons for this. And this is getting back to, this question of, are porcupines declining in the West and elsewhere? Okay, so the first hypothesis we proposed is, of course, the history of lethal control. It's really hard to think about changes in porcupine distribution or abundance without, acknowledging the really long history of control of porcupines, which I've talked about in depth. And because, this can kind of explain the patterns we've seen, because porcupines are seen as pests on timberlands, most of the control efforts were focused in forests, which might explain why populations have decreased there more so than areas like grasslands. It's really hard to say if porcupines are increasing in desert scrub and grasslands, or just that they haven't decreased, and they have decreased in forests. Our study wasn't really designed to answer that question, but it is consistent with this trend where porcupine control might have lingering effects. Another possible mechanism is human modification of landscapes. So there's another piece of this puzzle about porcupines declining, whereas some reports suggest that porcupine populations were unnaturally high in the early and mid 1900s, when the damage was really noticeable in timber plantations. And so why would this be? As herbivores, porcupines rely on vegetation, and often the young growth of trees is more palatable, more nutritious. And so porcupines and other herbivores have an association with early successional forests. We saw this with deer, where they had population booms in the early and mid-centuries following the logging boom, and are often seen in newly regenerating forests and even clear cuts. So there's this hypothesis that timber harvest actually made some areas more hospitable for porcupines, leading to these problems with porcupine damage. And then with forests regenerating, we've actually seen a natural decline in their populations. One researcher in California, who was a professor at Humboldt in the 1970s, went so far as to say that porcupines were not even native to the coast, and that there was an invasion of Humboldt and Del Norte counties by porcupines. I don't know that I would go that far, but it is definitely realistic to think about how our modifications of forested landscapes have made areas more or less suitable for porcupines and other herbivores, and how that might be affected by cycles of succession since then. All right, a third and related hypothesis has to do with predator recovery. So at the time when porcupine populations were supposedly exploding in the early and mid 1900s, predators were also being heavily persecuted through fur trapping and removal efforts. So some people actually attributed the explosion of porcupines to reduction in predator populations like fishers and mountain lions. So it might make sense that recoveries of these predators have had an opposite effect, where porcupine numbers are going back down again. There are a couple of papers here I've shown that have found evidence. We know that predators can exert really powerful control on porcupine populations. In Nevada, there was this instance of near extinction of porcupine population by mountain lion pressure, which came about because of declines in deer. So in the area, some mountain lions switched to porcupines. Similarly, in Wisconsin fishers, due to some other changes in prey base and climate, shifting to porcupines, have really affected their populations there. So, you know, I've heard kind of anecdotally that a lot of mountain lions found in Oregon have porcupine quills in them. There's evidence that they're feeding on porcupines. I don't think there's as much evidence that fishers in the West have or are currently predating on porcupines, but there's a lot that we still don't know about those relationships. All right, so to conclude, along with the, you know, those 3 reasons that porcupines might have changes in their distribution and their ecological niche in the region and elsewhere, it's important to keep in mind, you know, some of these life history traits that I talked about. Porcupines are really long-lived and slow to reproduce. They only have 1 young per year, and they, you know, have really limited dispersal capabilities. And it's hard for them to recolonize areas where they've been extirpated. So with any decline in their populations, porcupines are going to need a long time to recover. And likely it's a combination of all 3 of these factors that's sort of influencing the patterns that we've seen in declines and shifts in where they are in the region. Of course, there are other possible explanations. Disease, rodenticide poisoning are often brought up, but we don't really have any evidence of those. So I know this might be sort of an unsatisfying answer, but I hope it gives you a good idea of what we know about porcupines and what their history is. So just to finish, I've found in my experience that porcupines are a really humbling species to study. You know, they're really slow, often described as kind of not the smartest animals. Seemingly they just live in trees and eat leaves, but really they have these remarkable adaptations and roles in the ecosystem that we're kind of just beginning to understand. And they kind of force us to question what we know about everything from biogeography and evolution to how we manage landscapes and what we know about history. Porcupines can really thrive on human activity in some ways, but are really vulnerable to it in others. And so, you know, I think knowing that porcupine populations can go from what was perceived to be a huge excess to not being seen for decades is really remarkable and important to keep in mind as we think about their future. So thank you again for joining, and I hope I've imparted a greater appreciation of porcupines to you through this talk.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That was a fantastic presentation, very informative. And we have a lot of questions coming in, so I'm just gonna get right into it. Are there any places in Oregon where you would recommend going to see a porcupine?
That's a great question. I have actually not seen a porcupine in Oregon. I split my time between Washington and Oregon, and I did most of my work in California, but I have heard the Oregon dunes and the coastal areas in southwestern Oregon are a good place to see them. I often see reports on iNaturalist of porcupines around Bend area as well. So yeah, I would start there. I often look on iNaturalist for to see reports of where people have seen them lately. So that might be a good place to start.
Okay. Awesome. And then I have a question about kind of their general decline. So to the best of your knowledge and in terms of any area, how much have the population of porcupines declined?
Yeah, so it sort of depends. I think there are a couple of ways to think about it. There's sort of a decline in population or abundance, but also a decline in the distribution, which is, you know, shrinking of places where they used to be found and aren't found anymore. And that's sort of been more the focus of what I've done. It's actually really hard to survey for porcupines and to get accurate numbers of their abundance. So in terms of numbers of like how much any given population has changed, it's really hard to say. But I will say, you know, it's not just a Pacific Northwest thing. You know, declines have been found in Montana, seems to be pretty hard hit, and other areas as well. So I'm not sure really how to answer that question. We wish we knew more, I guess, is all that I'll say.
Right. Okay.
Do you want me to keep sharing my screen or should I exit?
Oh, I mean, it's an adorable picture, so
it is.
If you keep sharing it.
I just realized I did have an acknowledgement slide that I will just share really quickly, including all the funding sources and the people who've helped with all this work. So I didn't want to forget that, but I can go back to the Porcupine for more questions.
Perfect, thank you. And then we have a couple questions about how much do average adult porcupines weigh?
Well, that's a good question. So porcupines in the West actually seem to be bigger than in other areas. So we were measuring them in kilograms. Most of the adult porcupines we captured were between 7 and 12 kilograms, which I think ends up on the upper range of about 23 pounds. So they're not small. They're, I think, smaller in the Northeast. They're maybe around like 5 to 8 kilograms for an adult. And then I've heard in Alaska, they're as big as a Volkswagen is what I've been told, but the porcupines I've seen in Alaska weren't quite as big as a Volkswagen. But yeah, I'd say about 15 to 20 pounds for an adult. And then the porcupines are a couple pounds, maybe a pound when they're born, about 500 grams.
Okay, very cute. And then can porcupines regrow their quills? And then also, this person says that while they're living in the bush in Alaska, their German Shepherd must have bitten a porcupine and they had to pull out around like 100 quills. How many quills can a porcupine lose in defense before it is at risk? So that, and then also if the quills grow back.
Yeah, great question. I definitely feel for anyone who's had to deal with porcupine quills and dogs. I know it's another reason porcupines are unpopular with a lot of people. Porcupine quills do grow back. And, I mentioned they're just modified hairs. In terms of how quickly they grow back, I don't actually know. And I haven't really found a good source for that. And a lot of it actually does depend on their body condition. So how, in the wintertime, they're really devoting all of their resources to staying alive. And so it would be harder for a porcupine to lose a lot of quills in the winter. It would make them way more vulnerable. And also just, for thermal regulation. If you have a lot of bare patches on your body, it's going to make it hard in the wintertime. So I haven't heard of loss of quills being a contributing factor to porcupines starving to death or dying from exposure. I don't think that most, if you get to the point where a porcupine is losing most of its quills, it's probably, the predators probably killed it already. So I wouldn't worry about a dog getting a load of quills from a porcupine really having much effect on the porcupine, unless they kind of have repeated events where they have to release a bunch of quills into a predator. I think they're probably going to be just fine.
Okay, and then kind of related to that, what's the best way to remove porcupine quills from a pet or, anything?
Yeah, I hope it doesn't happen, but there is sort of this myth too that they're hollow and you're supposed to cut them to release pressure and pull them out, which is actually a bad idea. There's no such suction or anything like that. And if you cut them, it just actually makes them harder to pull out. So you need to do it as soon as you can because the microscopic barbs on the quills will make them work farther in to the muscle the longer you wait. So the best way is just to grab it, ideally with tweezers as close to the skin as you can and just pull straight out. So no cutting, no bending. I know it's a lot easier said than done. If you get them in you, ideally have someone else take them out for you.
Good to know. Let's see, are porcupines social animals that live in a group or do they tend to live by themselves?
Yeah, porcupines are fairly solitary. So often you see just one porcupine, they don't really have a social structure, in terms of a family group or that kind of thing. Mother and baby pairs are pretty common to see. They'll nurse for about 4 months and then usually stay with the mom for the remainder of their first year. Having said that, I did often observe pairings and groups of porcupines that didn't necessarily make sense. We often found 2 males in a tree next to each other feeding, a male and a baby, 3 females. Interesting groupings. And I do think there's a lot we don't know about social dynamics of porcupines. I've kind of heard this from other researchers that it's really thought that they're not that social, but there have been observations of these interesting groups. In other places where, you know, with snowy winters, porcupines use rock dens in the wintertime or dens in trees. We don't find that behavior so much out in the West, but you do get pretty big congregations of porcupines in the winter in those areas. And it's mostly thought to just be out of necessity. They'll share resources when they have to, but they're not necessarily social.
Gotcha. Okay. We still have a few more questions. Is it okay if I slightly extend the Q&A by like 5 minutes maybe?
Oh, no problem for me.
Okay. I just want to try to get through as many of these as possible. Could you talk a little bit more about how and what other animals would use the habitat that porcupines create, like dead trees or anything like that?
That's a great question, and something I wish there was more research on. I've looked for studies on this, and one that comes to mind is actually a study about porcupines and snowshoe hares, where porcupines feeding in the canopy of conifer trees will create what's called nip twigs. So they'll nip off a branch, eat some of the needles, and kind of drop the rest. And snowshoe hares will come along and eat the rest because they don't climb, and so they would get the ground feeding. In terms of other direct links, I don't know any, and that I would really love to do more research on that or hear about more. I just think that this general concept of tree damagers as a functional role, this is something that my advisor Tim Bean is starting to focus on a lot. It's kind of an underappreciated role in the forest. And, you know, we think about how we can make snags for owls and other cavity nesting animals, and we have animals like porcupines that damage and kill trees that do it for us. So sort of a general answer, but
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Thank you. Let's see. How do you think porcupines may be affected by climate change?
Yeah, a couple of ways. So in my work, we weren't directly looking at this. We only had a couple of seasons of field work, but California is experiencing, pretty extreme droughts. The years that I was doing my study, even in, coastal Del Norte County, the summers are really dry. And if that means, lower productivity of this broadleaf vegetation that porcupines need to build up fat stores in the summer, that could really impact their life history. What we saw the years of my study were not only drought summers, but followed by really historically wet winters. And so you have this sequence of events where porcupines aren't able to get as much to eat, and maybe aren't able to get as much to eat in the summer, and then have a really hard time surviving in the cold, wet winters. If that, of course, there are other things that could happen. Maybe it'll lead to longer growing seasons, might have more vegetation. So there's a lot that we don't know. Another area where this has been studied is in Wisconsin. So researchers, Jonathan Pauly is a researcher who's looked at this with the relationships between porcupines, fishers, and snowshoe hares. And the connection there with climate change is that snowshoe hares are retreating northwards, basically. So their range is retracting because they're very snow adapted. And as they're disappearing from lower latitude areas, fishers and other predators are actually switching to feeding on porcupines. So it's an indirect effect where climate-induced shifts in other species is having this effect on porcupines through predation.
So interesting.
Thank
you.
Interesting example.
I think I have time for one more question probably. So I noticed that one slide. So why are porcupines' teeth orange?
Oh, yeah. They are orange because there's an enamel on them that keeps them stronger. So it's an iron enamel. A lot of rodents have this also. So it's not because they're dirty or anything, but it helps keep them strong. And like all rodents, their teeth keep growing, their incisors at least keep growing throughout their whole life. So yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I, for one, learned so much about porcupine that I didn't know before. It was a really great presentation and had a lot of great questions. So thank you everyone for joining tonight to learn about porcupine. Thank you, Cara, for that great presentation. And I hope you all have a great night.
Thanks very much for having me.
Bye.